Lysimachus, killed in action in 281 BCE. Lysimachus was either a first or second tier player throughout the entire Successor period, assuming his post after the 323 settlement in Babylon, and only relinquishing his dreams of empire when he was slain in battle over 4 decades later. Just a few months before his killer and last remaining first-generation rival Seleucus was also killed. Yet, despite his importance, Lysimachus has not received the kind of popular fanfare that Antigonus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus received from modern history buffs. Scholars find Lysimachus interesting, but the sources on his life and deeds are somewhat scanty, so while he has fared better among scholars than laypeople, he is still frequently excluded from short lists of the greatest successors. Lysimachus's reputation has benefited greatly from Helen Lund's 2002 book about him, and his stock is slowly rising. However, Lysimachus remains the most underrated and understudied of the successors. When it comes to Lysimachus's early life and family origins, our sources do not provide us with many definite details. Lysimachus's father was named Agathocles, which was apparently a family name since Lysimachus later passed it on to his own son. There is a tradition that he was a Thessalian Greek who was taken in by Philip II because of the strong bond between Philip and Lysimachus's father, but this story does not really make sense. As we have seen, Eumenes and Nearchus were both Greeks who mostly grew up among the Macedonians, and yet neither of them were granted full acceptance into the Macedonian aristocracy. Due to his bodyguard status, he must have been from one of the more prominent families in Macedon. Perhaps his mother was a Thessalian noblewoman, and this was later either used by Lysimachus to enhance his claim on Thessaly, or else it was used by his enemies to undermine his legitimacy as a true Macedonian. Like all of the boys who were brought up at Pella alongside Alexander, Lysimachus had access to an excellent education. While many of the successors did not undertake any intellectual pursuits after receiving their education, Lysimachus retained a keen interest in philosophy throughout his life, and he was especially fond of the teachings of Calanus. Calanus was one of the Indian philosophers whom Alexander met in the East, and who later famously committed suicide by self-immolation in early 323. He and Lysimachus were close, and he gave Lysimachus his horse prior to his death. In the eyes of the Macedonians, Calanus and the other gymnosophists, the naked philosophers, represented the honesty and wisdom of the Far East. As one of Alexander's 7 original bodyguards, Lysimachus served alongside his king in all of his major battles and campaigns, so far as we know. He is only mentioned by name a few times in Arrian's narrative, and he never achieves anything truly noteworthy. Like many of the successors, Lysimachus suffered physical wounds for Alexander and took a bride at Susa in 324. In Quintus Curtius's account, Lysimachus worked with his fellow bodyguard Leonidas to calm and disarm Alexander at the fateful banquet when he drunkenly murdered Cleitos the Black for suggesting that Philip II was the better king and that adopting Eastern customs was foolish. A somewhat fanciful story has Lysimachus feeling sympathy for the accused court historian Callisthenes and for slipping him poison to end his suffering. For this act, Alexander supposedly threw Lysimachus to a lion. Either the story was fabricated, or else Lysimachus was forced to kill a lion to save his life, and in the process somehow allayed Alexander's anger. So far as I can tell, this story was one that Lysimachus himself loved to tell, and may very well have invented in order to make himself sound and look tougher. The most interesting anecdote dates from years after Alexander's campaigns, when an Alexander historian named Anisocrates was presenting his work to Lysimachus and talking about the Amazons, at which point Lysimachus smiled and asked where he had been when the Macedonians had had that particular encounter. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323, Perdiccas presided over a tumultuous settlement which featured a mutiny, the elevation of 2 kings who would require long-term regents, and the dispatch of almost all of Alexander's great generals to far-flung commands throughout the vast empire that they had helped him conquer. Lysimachus does not seem to have contributed anything noteworthy to the conference, but as a bodyguard he was certainly present, and he sided with Perdiccas in the cavalry against Meleager and the Macedonian phalanx. As a bodyguard, and one whom Perdiccas does not seem to have regarded as a great threat, Lysimachus was given a modest army and sent to Thrace, which was detached from Antipater's command and placed under his control. Lysimachus was tasked with the further taming of this restive area, a task comparable to the one that Perdiccas laid down for Eumenes in Cappadocia, except far more difficult. Thrace had been conquered in the time of Philip II, but Macedonian control was never firmly established. Alexander's focus was on the conquest of Asia, and Antipater's main priorities were protecting Macedonia from Illyrian invasions and keeping the Greeks in line. It appears that in the time between Philip's death and Lysimachus's arrival in 323, the Thracians had been developing and making strides toward becoming more urbanized and organized. Although the Greeks portray the Thracians as savages who were only really useful for soldiering and slavery, the fact is that Thrace had cities, had long embraced many aspects of Greek culture, and its leaders were plugged in with the international politics of both the greater Greek world and the barbarian world north of the Danube. Local Thracian chiefs had their own little fiefdoms, and their loyalty to Lysimachus's authority was mostly nominal and dependent upon circumstances. The preeminent Thracian leader of this age was Seuthes III, the leader of the Odrysians. Seuthes III has been compared to Philip II and may very well have been on a path toward creating a unified Thracian kingdom comparable to Macedon or Epirus. Seuthes had founded a capital city called Seuthopolis, which shows his power and ambition. When he received news of Alexander's death, he immediately started a revolt, and it was this revolt that Lysimachus found when he arrived at his new post. In addition to the problems posed by the Thracians, Lysimachus could also look forward to uncooperative Greek cities in coastal Thrace, which resented Macedonian rule and taxation. The Greek cities of the region were Lysimachus's biggest source of revenue, so he had to tie up a considerable portion of his manpower maintaining garrisons to keep his treasury from running completely dry. To the north of Thrace, the Getae were an entirely unsubdued tribe that neither Philip nor Alexander had attempted to conquer. Getae raids and invasions were a serious threat to Thrace. The Thracians, Getae, and far northern Greeks were all hostile to Lysimachus and would show themselves capable of coordinated actions. In our sources, Lysimachus has a reputation as being a military genius, and perhaps it was his ability to operate successfully in this environment which gave him that reputation. As the strategos of Thrace, Lysimachus was nominally subordinate to Antipater, but neither Antipater nor his successors in Macedon would ever issue orders to Lysimachus, who was his own man for all practical intents and purposes. In Thrace, Lysimachus had a chance to achieve military glory without having to worry about shocking public sentiment by causing the death of another successor or an Argead royal. On the other hand, the enormity of Lysimachus's task kept him engaged, and his ability to get involved in the early wars of the successors was quite limited. And Lysimachus would develop, perhaps out of necessity, a style of governing that was authoritarian and harsh, which did not endear him to his new subjects when he eventually expanded outward from Thrace. When Antipater was in dire straits during the Lamian War of 323 to 322, it appears that he didn't even consider summoning Lysimachus for aid, since he knew that Lysimachus was embroiled in the revolt of Seuthes, which was also a serious threat to the integrity of the empire. Lysimachus gave Antipater and Craterus his permission when they crossed his territory to enter Asia and fight the First War of the Successors. At the Triparadisus settlement of 321, the newly appointed regent Antipater rewarded and courted Lysimachus by confirming him in his position and arranging a marriage between the Thracian general and his daughter Nicaea, recently widowed after the death of Perdiccas. During the Second War of the Successors, Lysimachus was sympathetic to his brother-in-law Cassander, but he was unable to provide any material assistance due to the situation in Thrace. Like the other successors who favored Cassander, Lysimachus's reasons were mostly self-serving, as Cassander did not have the clout to pose a major threat to his position in Thrace. It is also possible that Cassander and Lysimachus were genuinely friends, however, since the two of them were always on the same side until Cassander's death in 297. It is more likely, however, that Lysimachus's cooperation with Cassander had more to do with the two of them sharing strategic interest than it did with any kind of personal affection. If Cassander was Lysimachus's friend, then this means that he is the only other person outside of Colonus who we can say is even a candidate to be a friend of Lysimachus. At some unknown point in this early period, Lysimachus and Seuthes III made a peace agreement. We don't know the details, but it would seem that Lysimachus succeeded in containing Seuthes, but was not strong enough to snuff out his nascent kingdom. In 314, the Third War of the Successors broke out when Lysimachus joined Cassander, Ptolemy, and Seleucus to oppose Antigonus the One-Eyed, who by then controlled the entirety of Alexander's Asian possessions after he had evicted Seleucus from Babylon. While this conflict is primarily remembered for Antigonus's battles with Ptolemy and Seleucus in the east, Lysimachus's actions were crucial to the war's outcome. Early in the war, Antigonus intended to strike at Lysimachus and Cassander in Europe, sensing that both of them were vulnerable and that the time was right for him to return to his homeland. After defeating the general Lysander and gaining access to the Hellespont in 313, Antigonus prepared to cross into Europe against Lysimachus. In conjunction with Lysimachus's local enemies, Antigonus funded a revolt by the Greek cities of Thrace, which expelled their Macedonian garrisons, allied themselves with the local tribes, and challenged Lysimachus. Seuthes III also rose up, possibly with Scythian aid, and Antigonus dispatched an army to help the rebels. This was a daunting challenge for anyone. However, Lysimachus would quickly prove that he was up to the task. Acting swiftly, Lysimachus arrived before the revolting cities had time to make the proper preparations for war. Fearing sieges at the hands of a skilled general like Lysimachus, the Greek cities quickly surrendered and accepted their garrisons back. One city, Cletus, decided to bank on Antigonus's arrival and endured a siege which lasted until 309. At the same time that he was subduing his Greek cities, Lysimachus sent a force to plug the mountain pass which Antigonus's army would need. While Antigonus's men were delayed, Lysimachus took the opportunity to meet and defeat Seuthes III's army. It is not clear how many men were in the Antigonan army, nor who was leading it. However, it is likely that this army was banking on local support in order to fight Lysimachus, and was therefore on the smaller side. In whatever event, Lysimachus fought a pitched battle against this army, and won. Thus, Lysimachus had foiled Antigonus's elaborate and well-laid plan, providing the best surviving example of why he had a reputation for military brilliance. Following his display of strength and military prowess, Lysimachus was able to bring Seuthes to the negotiating table. The pact that the two of them had formed earlier was renewed, and they deepened their ties by an exchange of brides. Once again, Lysimachus was the victor, but he was not quite strong enough to conquer and annex Seuthes' holdings outright. While Antigonus's northern efforts against Lysimachus had failed horribly, his forces were doing well in Greece against Cassander, with his general Aristometus and his nephew Ptolemaeus making considerable progress. Encouraged by their victories, Antigonus tried to negotiate with the city of Byzantium for their cooperation in his efforts to cross the Hellespont. Apparently, neither Antigonus nor Lysimachus seems to have possessed any notable naval strength, if the defection of Byzantium alone would have been sufficient to get Antigonus into Europe. Lysimachus also spoke with the city's leaders, and they ultimately decided to stay loyal to Lysimachus's side, despite the overall state of the war favoring Antigonus. Perhaps Lysimachus's recent display of military skill was enough to persuade them not to fuck with Lysimachus. Antigonus may have been able to find a way into Europe and on to victory if it hadn't been for the successes of Ptolemy on land and Seleucus by sea against his lieutenants in the eastern Mediterranean. Losing ground on other fronts, Antigonus withdrew from Asia Minor with his main field army, thus sparing Lysimachus and Cassander from further threat of invasion from the east. Cassander had been trying to tap out of the Third War of the Successors for a while, and he finally got Lysimachus and Ptolemy to side with him when Seleucus raised a revolt in Babylonia and the eastern satrapies. The three allies concluded a peace with Antigonus and left Seleucus in the lurch. Seleucus ultimately prevailed in the Babylonian War, but the outcome of the war seems to have been unclear at the time when the peace was agreed to. Had Antigonus defeated Seleucus, then the allies would have found themselves back to where they had been in 314, with Antigonus on the cusp of total victory. They were lucky that Seleucus won. After his successful defense of Thrace from Antigonus, Lysimachus enjoyed a sufficient degree of peace and stability that allowed him to begin to focus on internal improvements and to set himself up for greater things. One of Lysimachus's projects was to found cities in Thrace that would enhance his control and advance Hellenization in the area. His main foundation was a city called Lysimachia, the new capital of Thrace, which he founded in 310 BCE. This establishment shows that Lysimachus had regal ambitions, just like his foes. In addition, when he added lands outside of Thrace to his domain, Lysimachus seems to have retained Lysimachia as his capital. In 309, Antigonus and Seleucus concluded a peace deal, which saw Seleucus take control of Babylonia and the east, while Antigonus retained most of Asia Minor and Syria. Seleucus decided to focus on the empire's neglected eastern frontiers, which were now in danger, while Antigonus decided to get even with Cassander and Ptolemy. It is not quite clear what Lysimachus was up to when he was sitting out of the war's first few years, but it is likely that he was further consolidating Thrace. Lysimachus stood aloof from joining either side, and his neutrality in the Fourth War of the Successors, which began in 308, made him one of the major X factors of the conflict. Lysimachus's neutrality allowed Antigonus to concentrate his forces under Demetrius and to achieve victories against both Ptolemy and Cassander. It was only when Demetrius invaded Thessaly with 50,000 men with the intention of overrunning all of Macedon that Lysimachus intervened on behalf of his brother-in-law and the anti-Antigonid coalition. To relieve pressure on Cassander while focusing on his own self-interest, Lysimachus invaded Asia Minor and began to try to capture some of Antigonus's core territories. Antigonus was alarmed when Lysimachus began to capture some of his key possessions, and the old, one-eyed general mobilized a large army and set out to contain the invasion. Antigonus recalled Demetrius with the majority of his force, and this allowed Cassander to dispatch his brother Plistarchus and his trusted general Prepolaus with reinforcements. Lysimachus was the overall commander of this army, at least to this point. Outnumbered by Antigonus's forces, Lysimachus and his Antipatrid allies were no doubt relieved when Seleucus arrived with 20,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and hundreds of war elephants. With Seleucus's arrival, the two sides found themselves roughly equal in strength, although Antigonus had the edge in infantry 70,000 to 64,000, whereas the allies were superior in cavalry by a significant margin, 15,000 versus 10,000, and in elephants around 400 to oppose the 75 veteran pachyderms of Antigonus. While Lysimachus and Seleucus both claimed to be kings, it appears that Lysimachus was most likely the overall commander at Ipsus. Our evidence is sketchy, but Diodorus's phrasing when he describes the struggle between the elephants of Antigonus and Lysimachus makes it sound as if he is equating the two men as the overall commanding officers of their respective armies. It is also highly likely that Lysimachus contributed the largest single contingent of the coalition army, and that is another reason to assume that he was in command. During the actual fighting, Seleucus's actions in using his elephants to prevent Demetrius's victorious wing from returning to strike the allied phalanx, and the work of his horse archers in demoralizing the Antigonid phalanx proved decisive. Antigonus, the front-runner in the race to succeed Alexander for nearly 2 decades, lay dead on the field of battle. A number of modern scholars think that the last chance for a completely unified empire died with Antigonus at Ipsus. However, it does not appear that either Lysimachus or Seleucus read modern accounts of their time, and they certainly did not accept this assessment. In the aftermath of Ipsus, no one was in a great position to achieve a quick unification. However, with the right moves to build up power and prestige, a couple of lucky breaks, and another decisive battle or two, the empire might yet be unified. All of the anti-Antigonid powers benefited from Ipsus, but no one more so than Lysimachus. Not only had his first foray outside of Thrace ended with success, but it had been a smashing victory which had greatly increased his lands, revenue, and the size of his army. Although a few areas on the Black Sea coast were able to capitalize on the chaos after the battle to slip out of Macedonian hands, Lysimachus found himself in possession of what Antigonus had held in 318, but with the addition of Thrace. By this point, Lysimachus was around 60 years old, but he was still vigorous and in great health, so he still had time on his side. However, as a general and decision-maker, it appears that Lysimachus peaked at Ipsus and declined over the next couple of decades, if we are to judge from the decisions that he made and his record in the field. Sometime prior to 301, Lysimachus had followed the example of Antigonus and Demetrius and declared himself king. Like all of the successor kings, he issued propaganda portraying himself as the truest of Alexander's successors. Interestingly, of all of the successors, only Lysimachus seems to have had the respect for history and tradition to bestow care and largesse on the city of Troy when it was a part of his realm. Alexander and his best friend Hephaestion had been obsessed with Troy, and it is odd that Lysimachus was the first person to use his control of Troy to emphasize that link with the dead conqueror that all of the successors had been well aware of. Defeated but not finished, Demetrius tried to resuscitate the Antigonid Empire. While he waited for the coalition to dissolve into infighting, Demetrius decided to raid the Thracian Chersonese. Demetrius's actions ended up sparking a great mutiny against Lysimachus. Presumably, many of the mutineers were men who had surrendered at Ipsus and then been assigned to Thrace, so perhaps Demetrius was hoping that they would rally to the Antigonid banner and give him an instant army. As he had done when Antigonus had invaded Thrace, Lysimachus struck swiftly. It isn't clear whether there was a pitched battle or whether Lysimachus captured these men by other means, but in the end he executed thousands of his own soldiers and brought the mutiny to a close. It is also worth mentioning, of course, that Lysimachus and Demetrius absolutely hated each other, and this may very well have been the cause of Lysimachus's hatred for Demetrius. While peace still held between the allies, everyone was jockeying for position. The desperate Demetrius finally found a friend in Seleucus, while Lysimachus and Ptolemy found themselves warming to one another. Lysimachus viewed Demetrius as his biggest immediate problem, and Ptolemy's navy, which was still formidable, would be extremely useful for capturing Demetrius's coastal holdings. To seal an alliance with Ptolemy, Lysimachus agreed to marry his daughter Arsinoe. Cassander spent most of this period fighting in Greece and struggling with illness, so he was not terribly active on the international scene. In 297, probably early in the year, northern Thrace faced an invasion by the Getae. Lysimachus sent his son Agathocles to contain this threat. Agathocles, however, was captured by the Getae, and this forced Lysimachus to make concessions. He ceded some territory to the Getae and gave the Getae king Dromachiades the hand of one of his daughters. This secured Agathocles' return and ended the war for the moment, but it did not resolve the issue, at least not in Lysimachus' mind. In 297 BCE, Cassander died of edema at the age of 53. Only one of his sons was remotely qualified to succeed him, but this son, Philip IV, shared his father's ailment, and he too perished within months of his father. This pair of deaths led to an antipatrid civil war between Cassander's other sons. Lysimachus had a strong stake in this contest, as he was the father-in-law of Cassander's son Antipater, but his hands were temporarily tied up by the Getae invasion. In the meantime, this gave Pyrrhus of Epirus and Demetrius an opening. Luckily for Lysimachus, Demetrius and Pyrrhus had gone from being friends to foes, so he did not have to worry about the two of them coordinating against him. When Lysimachus was finally in a position to intervene, he found that Demetrius and Pyrrhus had divided most of Macedon between them. Having missed out on the partition of Macedon, Lysimachus still found himself with an opportunity that arose from the Antipatrid collapse. When young Antipater fled to his court requesting military aid, he had a bargaining chip to use against Demetrius. In exchange for Lysimachus keeping Antipater in check, Demetrius agreed to formally renounce his claims on all of his former possessions in Asia Minor that had been lost at Ipsus. A few years later, for reasons unknown, Lysimachus had Antipater put to death. Over the next few years, Lysimachus seems to have focused his attention on consolidating Asia Minor, and he made considerable gains down to 294. With the Asiatic Greek cities firmly in his grasp, Lysimachus decided that it was a good time to deal with the Getae. In 293, Lysimachus broke the truce and invaded Getae territory. Unfortunately for him, he fared no better than his son had, and he too was captured and carried away to the Getae capital of Hellas and held for a year. King Dromachiades only agreed to release Lysimachus after he ceded more territory to the Getae and agreed to hand over hostages to ensure his future good behavior. Shortly after his return from captivity, Lysimachus received news in 292 that Demetrius had just launched a massive invasion of Thrace. Still reeling from his defeat and captivity, Lysimachus's plans for dealing with this invasion are unknown, but ultimately proved to be unnecessary. Demetrius had to abandon this invasion before it got off to a proper start due to a Greek rebellion backed by Ptolemy's money and Pyrrhus of Epirus, who had not given up on claiming the Macedonian crown. To contain the grave threat posed by Demetrius, Lysimachus made common cause with Pyrrhus and Ptolemy. This conflict would also draw in Seleucus and is known to history as the Fifth War of the Successors. In early 288, Ptolemy's fleet arrived in southern Greece to spark revolts in the Greek cities, while Lysimachus and Pyrrhus invaded Macedon from the north and west respectively. Leaving his son Antigonus II in control of Greece, Demetrius took the bulk of his considerable army to Macedon and tried to face Lysimachus and Pyrrhus separately. When Demetrius drew up near Lysimachus, some of his men defected, and this was enough to deter Demetrius from pressing the issue. When he lined up against Pyrrhus, Demetrius faced the same problem. By the end of 288, Lysimachus found himself in possession of eastern Macedon, while his ally Pyrrhus secured control of the west. The reason why all of the allies had ganged up on Demetrius is because he had raised about 100,000 men, and he was planning to invade Asia. The reason why Demetrius's troops were so disloyal to him is because he had ruled tyrannically in Macedon, and he had incurred great unpopularity with the men. So for Lysimachus, this was one of the luckiest breaks that he ever received, and almost certainly the easiest battlefield victory that he ever secured, since it didn't require any actual fighting. In 287 BCE, Demetrius took his entire army and fleet with the exception of the small force that he left behind for Antigonus II, and he set off for Asia Minor, where he was aiming for Lysimachus's Greek cities. Since the area had been governed by Antigonus for a long time and he had been very popular, Demetrius's strategy, which Plutarch and others have chalked up to megalomania, was perhaps more realistic than Plutarch seems to have thought. Unfortunately for Lysimachus, but perhaps not surprisingly given his passive-aggressive foreign policy, Ptolemy did not send his fleet to intercept Demetrius's invasion force. When Demetrius arrived in Asia, the responsibility for conducting the defense of Lysimachus's realm, after a time, fell to his son Agathocles. At first, the sheer mass of Demetrius's force, which was building with local support, and the reputation of his late father, helped him to win over a number of coastal cities and compelled the governors of Lydia and Caria to submit. Next, Demetrius turned inland to deal with Agathocles. Agathocles knew that with the size of Demetrius's force, that attrition and delay were the orders of the day, and that separating Demetrius's army and fleet was vital. When he had drawn Demetrius in, Agathocles ordered other forces to recapture the cities that had fallen to Demetrius earlier, while he kept Demetrius occupied. This undid the gains of Demetrius while exacerbating his logistical difficulties. Demetrius's mercenaries, whom he had hired to fill out his ranks before launching his grand invasion, began to desert in great numbers, and it became clear to him that he was not strong enough at that time to face Agathocles. When Demetrius made for the Taurus Mountains and Seleucus's lands beyond, babbling about recruiting more men and media, Agathocles happily watched him go. After a couple of years and some attempts at guerrilla warfare, Demetrius was eventually compelled to surrender to Seleucus in 284. When news of this outcome reached Lysimachus, he sent urgently to Seleucus, urging him to execute Demetrius at once. To secure the outcome that he desired, Lysimachus even offered Seleucus a large sum of money if he would just put Demetrius out of his misery. However, Seleucus declined to do so, preferring instead to keep Demetrius confined to Apamea in case he found a use for him as a bargaining chip or wild card to play. Demetrius, however, ate and drank himself to death in the following year, 283. Lysimachus was suspicious of Seleucus's conduct, even though it was due to the actions of Lysimachus and Agathocles that Demetrius's army had entered Seleucus's territory in the first place. This disagreement seems to have greatly increased tension between the two old contenders, who had never been on good terms to begin with. By the mid-280s, Lysimachus was in a great position to fight wars of expansion and had an outside chance of reuniting the entirety of Alexander's empire for the first time in his career. Now in his 70s, Lysimachus needed to act in the near future. Like Seleucus, Lysimachus had a proven heir in place, a massive revenue, and a solid population base. With Ptolemy I retiring in 285 in favor of his son Ptolemy II, who was young and hardly a warrior, but intelligent and could be expected to improve over time, this meant that Lysimachus could afford to focus his efforts elsewhere and deal with Egypt a little later. Lysimachus's best chance was to marshal a massive army against Seleucus and hope for an Ipsus-like victory that would more or less end Seleucus's empire at a stroke and then move quickly at Egypt. While it may have involved some wishful thinking in terms of being able to win a completely decisive victory, this was the best approach for someone in Lysimachus's position at this time. In 284, Lysimachus made further moves to consolidate his hold on Asia Minor once Demetrius was out of his hair. That year, he added Paphlagonia to his empire, and also brought the independent city of Heraclea Pontica back into his empire's fold. One of the reasons that Heraclea Pontica had managed to retain its independence for so long is that it was ruled by Amastris, a niece of Darius III and Lysimachus's ex-wife. When her two sons murdered her and took power, this gave Lysimachus a pretext for intervening to avenge her death. Back in Macedon, the division of the country between Lysimachus and Pyrrhus satisfied neither man. Pyrrhus made common cause with the Aetolians, Antigonus II, and Ptolemy, who always backed the weaker party to maintain the balance of power. When Lysimachus invaded western Macedon, Ptolemy refused to intervene out of fear. Likewise, Lysimachus successfully bribed the Aetolians into staying out of the fray. Lysimachus was able to reunite Macedon under his rule and add Thessaly, which had been controlled by the Macedonian crown since the time of Philip II. Next, we have the most puzzling episode of Lysimachus's career. Although Agathocles had proven himself as a son and heir, there was some kind of falling out between father and son in 284, which led Lysimachus to arrest and execute his son. Supposedly, Lysimachus had his son removed for his excessive royal ambitions. At first glance, this doesn't make much sense. As the only important son of Lysimachus, and as the man who had defeated Demetrius, one would think that Agathocles was a clear choice to succeed his father. Earlier, Antigonus and Demetrius had ruled as co-kings, and as of 294 or 293, Seleucus and Antiochus were joint kings as well. It is unclear why Lysimachus did not opt to associate with his son on the throne, especially given his own advanced age and the extent of the territory that he was already governing and was hoping to be responsible for in the near future. The two most likely explanations are as follows. One possibility is that Agathocles was contemplating revolt because he felt underappreciated, since he had not been rewarded in the same way as his peers like Antiochus. The most commonly accepted answer, however, is that Lysimachus was manipulated by his ambitious and persuasive wife Arsinoe to set Agathocles aside in favor of her son Ptolemy Epigonus, who was around 15 at this time. Arsinoe seems to have poisoned her aging husband's mind against his oldest son and convinced him that Agathocles was plotting treason and had to be assassinated. Of course, if Lysimachus did remove the proven Agathocles, who was 35 to 40 years old at this time, and highly accomplished for a teenager at a time when he was contemplating further conquest, and might die in the near future himself due to his own advanced age, then it is very safe to say that this was the worst decision of Lysimachus's life, and possibly the single worst decision of the entire Successor era, which of course featured many terrible decisions. In 282, having received Agathocles' widow and orphans at his court, Seleucus resolved upon war against Lysimachus, ostensibly to avenge the death of Agathocles. In reality, Seleucus was desirous of reuniting the entire empire that Alexander had once controlled, and he now smelled blood in the water. Lysimachus's removal of Agathocles and subsequent lack of responsiveness to Seleucus's invasion force make it quite possible that Lysimachus had gone soft between the years. Of course, if my first scenario for Agathocles' removal is correct, and it was because he was plotting revolt, then Lysimachus can hardly be blamed for taking action, and was perhaps acting rationally. Seleucus crossed the Taurus Mountains and made his winter camp in Lysimachus's empire. Lysimachus did not respond, but instead remained marshaled near Sardis, waiting for Seleucus to arrive. Seleucus's navy also began to make some attempts to win over the coastal cities of the Asiatic Greeks. When spring 281 arrived, Seleucus marched west and encountered Lysimachus at a place called Corupedium. At last, the two victors of Ipsus came together once more, not far from the site of the battle which had laid low Antigonus the One-Eyed. Perhaps it was fitting that the final confrontation of the first-generation successors came down to a contest between Lysimachus and Seleucus. Both men had been present since the beginning and participated in most of the major wars of the last 40 years. Both men had proven to be great governors and talented field commanders capable of achieving great things with limited resources and of coping with complex challenges. Neither man had started out as one of the major players in the Macedonian Game of Thrones, yet both of them steadily improved his position and survived until the very end. It is also interesting that of the successors, Lysimachus and Seleucus were the two men who had done the most to expand, defend, and Hellenize on the frontiers of Alexander's empire, whereas their long-fallen foes had concentrated their efforts on internecine conflict. If any one man was worthy of inheriting Alexander's empire, then the tamer of Thrace who prevented the rise of a strong Thracian state, and the man who checked Chandragupta Maurya and stabilized the eastern frontier, both had impeccable credentials. Either man would make a worthy ruler, but as in the Highlander films, there could only be one. In the spring of 281 BCE, Seleucus's army arrived at a spot near Sardis called Corupedium, which has been translated as the Plain of the Lord, or just as fittingly, the Plain of Plenty. After all, between them, the two elderly contestants held all of Alexander's old empire aside from Egypt, and the stakes could not have been higher. Seleucus's fleet was active on the western coast of Asia Minor, trying to win over Lysimachus's Greek cities, and had a bit of success, sparking a few civil wars. Most of the cities, however, adopted a wait-and-see approach. Lysimachus had been waiting for Seleucus's arrival thus far from his eastern border, possibly because, as Waterfield suggests, the execution of Agathocles had undermined his popularity in territories where his son had done most of the governing in recent years, and his son had also earned most of the loyalty in the process. The plain around Sardis was also a commonly chosen spot for battle, however, so it may simply have been Lysimachus's desire to fight it out in the open, where he may have had some advantage in numbers or cavalry. We know almost no details about the Battle of Corupedium. There are no certain details on how many men each army had, the respective orders of battle, or the names of any of the subordinate officers who participated. One person who was almost certainly present was Ptolemy Carinus, who had visited Lysimachus's court before finding a place at Seleucus's court. The battle resulted in a victory for Seleucus and in the battlefield death of Lysimachus. The one detail that we do have about Corupedium is precisely how Lysimachus was killed and by whom. A later source named Memnon of Heraclea wrote a local history of his home city, Heraclea Pontica, a city on the northern coast of Asia Minor facing the Black Sea. We mentioned them earlier. Heraclea Pontica had had issues with Lysimachus in the past. Memnon claims that at Corupedium, a native of the city of Heraclea Pontica named Malachron was the man who threw the javelin which claimed Lysimachus's life. Lysimachus had only just added this city to his realm within the last few years, and it appears that either the city revolted in favor of Seleucus, or else there were exiles like Malachron who were still unwilling to bend a knee to Lysimachus's new regime. Assuming that this local tradition is reliable, it was a fitting death for Lysimachus, who had spent about 6 consecutive decades of his life at war. Lysimachus's behavior toward his son and his conduct leading up to the clash at Corupedium have created a perception that he became a mad king during his last years. While this is far from impossible, it is not certain. When we consider that Lysimachus was a bitterly despised foe in the eyes of both the Antigonid and Seleucid houses, 2 of the 3 lasting dynasties, we can't discount the possibility that our accounts of Lysimachus's last days were slanted in a way designed to discredit him. However, given his advanced age and hard life, it doesn't seem too bold to speculate that the Lysimachus of 281 was a shadow of the man Perdiccas had posted to Thrace in 323. Lysimachus was granted the honor of a funeral pyre in the aftermath of Corupedium. While his ability to inspire others seems to have waned in the last few years of his life, Lysimachus still had the absolute loyalty of his dog, who threw itself onto the funeral pyre to share the fallen king's fate. Lysimachus's widow Arsinoe, the daughter of Ptolemy I and Eurydice, fled with money and troops and later married her half-brother Ptolemy Carinus, serving as Queen of Macedon. Lysimachus was a contender for Alexander's empire for over 4 decades, before he had his nascent kingdom wiped off the map by Seleucus. During that time, Lysimachus had time to disseminate his own version of events, and his enemies also had plenty of time to make sure to level their barbs against the tamer of Thrace. Like all of the successors, Lysimachus portrayed himself as Alexander's best friend and closest companion, although this does not appear to be an accurate portrayal of the past. Both Frontinus and Aelian mention that Lysimachus was a military genius, with Aelian going so far as to say that Alexander envied his bodyguard's strategic vision. However, neither of these authors provides much detail about Lysimachus's genius played out in practice. If Lysimachus was tougher, harder, harsher, and more arrogant than some of his peers, then it is partially because he may have had a chip on his shoulder about his origins, and he was given the hardest assignment of any of the successor generals when he was posted to Thrace. Most of our anecdotes about Lysimachus do not make him sound like an appealing person. He seems to have reveled in showing visitors the scars he picked up under Alexander, especially from the wounds inflicted by Alexander's lion. He seems to have lacked a good sense of humor, as he alone was offended to learn that Demetrius toasted him as a lowly treasurer rather than as a king. Lysimachus thought the title implied that he was a eunuch, an association Demetrius probably didn't intend. Seleucus, by contrast, laughed at the title Keeper of Elephants rather than taking it as a reference to his Medizing or his Persian wife. In Thrace, Lysimachus's decades of fighting prevented the formation of strong Thracian state, which may have weakened Macedon's preeminence in the long run in Europe during the 3rd century, had it been allowed to develop unimpeded under Seuthes III and his heirs. Both a gruff soldier and a learned man, Lysimachus simultaneously was a skilled state builder and someone who does not seem to have realized that old kings need to keep their successors alive and well for their life's work to be continued. His opponents tried to label him as a barbarian, and their smear was both true and false. In the end, Lysimachus may not have been the greatest of the successors, but he was almost certainly the most complex and definitely the most underrated of them all.